Hello, everyone. I'm John, and welcome back to ASMR True Crime Story, where I share true stories in a calm, relaxing whisper. Before we begin, press a number in the comments for me. Press 1 if you're already part of our ASMR family. Press 0 if this is your first time here. And press 2 if you want another whispered true story in the next upload. If you're enjoying the calm, please like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's case. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and slow your breathing. Let's begin. It was November of 2012 in Charlottesville, Virginia. The evening air was cool, the streets were busy, and people were preparing for the Thanksgiving holiday. But for one young woman, that night would mark her final moments in public view. Sage Smith, just 19 years old, stepped out onto Main Street, the very center of a college town known for its history, its students, and its bustling nightlife. She was on the phone, speaking with someone, promising she would be there in just a few minutes. To her stepsister, who briefly crossed her path, everything seemed ordinary. But after that, Sage vanished. There was no citywide search. No swarm of volunteers combing the streets, no FBI. Just silence, and a devastated family left to search for answers on their own. Sage's disappearance was not just another missing persons case. It revealed deep failures in how victims from marginalized communities are treated, and exposed how quickly some lives are dismissed when they don't fit society's idea of whose story matters. And so the question lingers to this day. What really happened to Sage Smith on that November night? Sage Smith entered the world as Dashad Smith, born into a family that had its struggles, but also its strength. Her parents separated not long after she was born. Her mother, overwhelmed and unable to provide the stability a child needed, had to step back. That left Sage in the care of someone who would become the most important figure in her life. Her grandmother, a woman known to everyone in Charlottesville as Miss Cookie. Miss Cookie was not just a caretaker, she was the backbone of her community. She lived in Garrett Square, an affordable housing complex in the city, and she was active in keeping that community together. She sat on the Tenants Association board, she worked with resident patrol, and she became a voice for the people around her. To Sage, she was more than a grandmother. She was a protector, a teacher, and an example of strength. From a young age, Sage was drawn to her grandmother's presence. Their bond was so strong that when life gave her choices, whether to stay with her mother or with Miss Cookie, she always chose her grandmother. To Sage, home was not just walls and furniture. Home was wherever Miss Cookie was. Her father, Dean Smith, lived nearby. He had his own struggles, including time spent in prison, but he remained in the picture. Even when he was distant, Sage knew her grandmother would make sure she never felt abandoned. But Sage's life was never simple. Growing up, she carried a secret that many around her already suspected. She was different, and in a world where different often meant danger, she had to decide when to speak her truth. One day, when she was still young, she sat with her grandmother and decided to share what was in her heart. "Grandma," she said, "I'm gay." Miss Cookie, calm and steady as always, looked at her grandchild and replied with the words Sage would never forget. "You're not telling me anything I didn't already know." Then she pulled her close, and they embraced for a long time. In that moment, Sage understood that no matter how the world treated her, she had someone who would always see her for who she truly was. That acceptance mattered, because outside her grandmother's home, Sage was already facing the cruelty of the world. At school, she became a target. Kids teased her, mocked her, and bullied her. There were days when the cruelty cut deep. On one painful occasion, when she tried to join the football team, she was humiliated before she ever stepped on the field. Members of the team urinated on her jersey, making it impossible for her to play. It was a moment that showed just how vicious young people can be, especially when someone stands out. Yet, despite the cruelty, Sage pushed forward. She was resilient. She carried herself with courage, often leaning on Miss Cookie for strength. Later, life threw her another challenge. Miss Cookie's health declined, and she couldn't take care of Sage for a time. That meant Sage had to live with her mother, but her mother, still struggling with stability, was found unfit to raise her. As a result, Sage spent time in foster care, a system that is difficult for any child, but especially for a young person already carrying the weight of rejection and misunderstanding. Still, Sage did not let her circumstances define her future. She became the first in her family to graduate high school, a milestone that made her grandmother proud. It was proof that no matter the obstacles, Sage could rise above them. When she turned 18, Sage began stepping fully into her independence. Through a program designed for young adults aging out of foster care, she received financial support that helped her secure her own apartment. She used part of those funds for rent and the rest to pay for cosmetology classes. She had found her path. She wanted to work in beauty, to style hair, to make others feel confident. And in that decision, you could see Sage's own spirit. She loved creativity. She loved bringing out beauty in others, even when the world often tried to strip her of her own. By this time, Sage had chosen her name. She was no longer Dashad. She was Sage Smith, and with her name came her truth. She began telling her family and friends that she was a transgender woman. Some accepted it quickly. Miss Cookie, of course, embraced her fully. Her mother supported her too, but not everyone was ready. Her father, Dean, struggled at first. When Sage first told him, he said hurtful things that created a painful distance between them. But with time, and with the encouragement of his younger son, Dean reflected on his mistakes. He even watched a film about a young man who lost his life because his family couldn't accept him, and it opened his eyes. He realized he could not let ignorance or fear take away his relationship with his own child, so he apologized. Slowly, he rebuilt his bond with Sage, and eventually he became one of her biggest supporters. He would proudly introduce her in public as his daughter. For Sage, that acceptance was priceless. It meant that even in a world that often rejected her, her father now stood beside her. Sage had built her own little world. She had her grandmother, her father, her mother, her siblings, and her friends. She had dreams of becoming a cosmetologist. She had her own apartment. She had even begun to form her chosen family with friends like Shakira Washington, another transgender woman who quickly became like a sister. But life for Sage was not without risk. Being a young black transgender woman in Charlottesville in 2012 meant living with constant challenges. It meant harassment on the streets. It meant discrimination at work. It meant danger in places where others felt safe. Yet Sage was determined to live authentically, to be herself, and to carve out a future where she could thrive. And it was this courage, this insistence on living her truth, that made her disappearance all the more devastating, because the world never gave Sage the protections and urgency it should have. In every story of hardship, there's often one figure who holds everything together. For Sage Smith, that figure was her grandmother, Miss Cookie. Miss Cookie was more than a guardian. She was a leader in her community, a woman whose voice carried weight in Charlottesville's neighborhoods. She worked on tenant boards, joined resident patrols, and stood up for fairness wherever she lived. For many children in the area, she was a role model. For Sage, she was a lifeline. From the very beginning, Miss Cookie raised Sage with firm love. She had already raised her own children, but when life pulled her granddaughter into uncertainty, she stepped forward again. She gave Sage a home, not just with the walls and furniture, but with warmth and belonging. Sage leaned on her grandmother in every way. If she was hurt at school, she went to Miss Cookie. If she was confused about herself, she turned to Miss Cookie. And when she finally came out as gay, before later transitioning, it was Miss Cookie who embraced her with no hesitation. She was the one who told Sage, "You're not telling me anything I didn't already know." That simple statement carried enormous power. It told Sage that she was seen, she was understood, and she was loved exactly as she was. Miss Cookie's strength shaped Sage's courage. It gave her the ability to live openly, even in a city that carried a long history of racial tension and resistance to change. Charlottesville, for all its beauty, was also a place where being black, being poor, and later being transgender meant facing daily challenges. Miss Cookie knew this. She had lived through segregation, through the struggles of Vinegar Hill and Five-Field neighborhoods. And she was determined that Sage would not face the world alone. When Sage grew older, she and her grandmother moved out of Garrett Square. Miss Cookie did not like the new fences being installed there. To her, the heavy wrought iron gave the place the feeling of a prison, so she chose to leave. They moved into the Five-Field neighborhood, a part of Charlottesville with a deep African American history, filled with families who had once been displaced from Vinegar Hill when it was destroyed under the name of urban renewal. In Five-Field, Sage found her grounding. She began forming friendships that would carry her into adulthood, including one that began in the most unexpected way. Her first meeting with Shakira Washington was not friendly. The two clashed, and it escalated into a fight so loud that people from both their homes ran out to stop it. But as is sometimes the case with young people, that first fight gave way to understanding. They realized they shared the same struggles. Shakira, already further along in her transition, had spoken openly to teachers and family about being a transgender woman. Sage, still presenting as Deshad at that time, saw in Shakira both a reflection of herself and a path toward honesty. The fight turned into a friendship, and soon into sisterhood. Miss Cookie welcomed Shakira as a part of their circle because she understood that her granddaughter needed not just family, but friends who truly understood her journey. Together, the two young women would face a world that too often tried to push them to the margins. Miss Cookie, though, remained the anchor. Even when her health forced her to step back for a time, she never let go of her role. And when she saw Sage grow strong enough to live independently, she supported her decisions. She believed in her granddaughter's future. For Miss Cookie, raising Sage was never a burden. It was a calling. She believed that every child deserved love, stability, and the chance to be themselves. And that is what she gave to Sage every single day. It is impossible to tell the story of Sage Smith without seeing the influence of Miss Cookie. She was the one who gave her courage. She was the one who taught her resilience. And when Sage disappeared, it was Miss Cookie whose pain spoke loudest. The pain of a grandmother who had done everything she could, but who still lost the child she had devoted her life to raising. From the outside, Sage's life looked like that of many children in Charlottesville. She went to school, she had friends, and she was being raised in a close-knit neighborhood. But inside those school walls, Sage lived a different reality. She was different, and kids could see it. At first, she was quiet about who she was, but children often sense difference before it is spoken. They teased her, whispered about her, and sometimes went beyond words to cruelty. School can be hard for any child, but for Sage, it was harder. She was not only black and living in poverty, she was also carrying the truth of her identity, something many around her did not understand or accept. There were days when the bullying was sharp and relentless. One story stayed with her family for years. Sage wanted to try out for the football team. She thought it might help her fit in, maybe give her a chance to be part of something bigger. But before she could ever step on the field, some players humiliated her in the worst way. They urinated on her jersey, making sure she could not wear it. She was crushed. not just by the act itself, but by the message it carried. You don't belong here. It was the kind of cruelty that could have broken her spirit, but Sage was stronger than that. She carried herself with a quiet resilience. She leaned on Miss Cookie when the pain was too much, and she reminded herself that she was more than what others said. As she grew, life handed her another challenge. Miss Cookie's health began to fail, and for a time she could no longer care for her granddaughter. Sage went to live with her mother, but her mother, still battling instability, was judged unfit to raise her, and so Sage entered foster care. Foster care is never easy, but for someone like Sage, it was even harder. Moving between environments, facing strangers, and living without the full support of family left her vulnerable. Yet even in that instability, she found a way to hold on to herself. Through all of this, Sage kept moving forward. She stayed in school, even when others mocked her. She kept her dreams alive, even when the world told her to give them up. And against all odds, she became the first person in her family to graduate from high school. That diploma was more than a piece of paper. It was proof of her determination. It was proof that she could rise above the cruelty, the poverty, the foster care system, and all the rejection. For her grandmother, for her father, and for herself, it was a moment of triumph. But finishing high school was not the end. It was the beginning of her adult life. A life where she would now step into independence, choose her own path, and finally begin living as the woman she had always known herself to be. Sage's courage had carried her through childhood. Now, as a young adult, she was ready to carry that courage into the wider world. After high school, Sage stood at the edge of adulthood. For most 19-year-olds, that time means choices, opportunities, and dreams. For Sage, it also meant survival. She had aged out of foster care, but she wasn't left entirely without support. She qualified for something called the Chafee Foster Care Independence Program. This program was designed to help young people like her, young adults who had grown up in foster care, step into independence. Through it, Sage received financial help. Each year, she could access up to $5,000. About 30% of that money could be used for housing. The rest had to go toward education. Sage used the program wisely. She took part of the money to rent her own apartment. It wasn't much, but it was hers. A space she could call her own. A space where she could finally breathe and live on her own terms. The other part of the funds she used to enroll in cosmetology classes. For Sage, beauty wasn't just a profession. It was a way of expression. She loved to style hair, braid, and practice makeup. She believed in helping people feel confident in themselves, something she had fought for in her own life. Cosmetology gave her purpose. It wasn't just about earning money. It was about building a career, a future, and a sense of pride. With each class, each haircut, and each style she practiced, she was building the life she wanted. Still, money was always tight. To keep herself afloat, Sage worked when she could. She styled hair for friends, braided for neighbors, and sometimes picked up minimum wage jobs. But jobs weren't easy to come by. Many places were reluctant to hire transgender women, and even when she found work, harassment often followed. To make things a little easier, Sage opened her apartment to her closest friends. She invited Shakira Washington and Aubrey Carson to live with her. They split what they could, leaned on each other, and made the apartment a shared home. This was not just about saving money. It was about building family. Shakira, Aubrey, and Sage were all transgender women, each facing the same struggles. Together, they became sisters. They supported one another through moments of joy and through moments of fear. Their apartment became known as the Dollhouse Mansion. The walls were painted bright pink, and it was filled with energy, laughter, and sometimes tears. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. By this time, Sage had embraced her full identity. On social media, she updated her profile, changing her gender to female and declaring proudly, "I'm a girl now." She was no longer hiding, she was Sage Smith. Her family reacted in different ways. Miss Cookie and her mother accepted her without hesitation. Her two sisters on her mother's side supported her too. But for her father, Dean, it had been a more difficult road. At first, Dean struggled with the news. He had grown up with certain beliefs, and when Sage came out, he said things that hurt her deeply. For a time, father and daughter didn't speak, but Dean wasn't a man who stayed stuck in pride. With encouragement from his younger son, and after watching the film Prayers for Bobby, about a gay boy who took his life after his mother's rejection, Dean realized the cost of not accepting his child. He reached out to Sage, he apologized, he told her he was wrong, and that he wanted to rebuild their bond. And slowly he did. Soon, Dean became one of the Sage's biggest supporters. He would introduce her proudly as his daughter. When she walked by the barber shop where he spent time, he would stop everything, call her inside, and tell everyone, "This is my child. This is my daughter, Sage." For Sage, those words mattered more than anything. Acceptance from her father gave her strength. It showed her she was loved, not just by her grandmother, but by the man whose approval she had longed for. Together with her friends, her grandmother, her mother, and her now supportive father, Sage was building a life. She had survived childhood bullying, foster care, and rejection. She had claimed her name, her identity, and her future. But independence also meant risk. Living as a young black transgender woman in Charlottesville came with daily challenges. There were insults shouted from strangers. There were men who threatened her in the streets. There were jobs she could not get and opportunities denied to her. And yet, Sage carried herself with confidence. She loved dancing, loved being the center of attention at the local gay club, and loved bringing life to every room she entered. Her laughter, her style, and her presence made her unforgettable to those who knew her. She was just beginning to live as her true self, just beginning to step fully into adulthood when everything changed. Because in November 2012, Sage's life, and the future she was building, was cut short by a disappearance that remains unsolved to this day. For Sage, independence never meant living alone. She believed in family, not just the family she was born into, but the family she chose for herself. When she settled into her apartment, she quickly opened her door to two of the most important people in her life, Shakira Washington and Aubrey Carson. Shakira had been her friend since their fiery first meeting in the Five-Field neighborhood. What began as a fight in the street had become a sisterhood. Shakira, who had already told her family and teachers about being a transgender woman, gave Sage a glimpse of courage when she needed it most. Their bond grew tighter with every year until they were almost inseparable. Aubrey was different, quieter, softer in personality, but just as much a part of their chosen family. Together, the three of them shared not only an apartment, but also the struggles of being young transgender women in a city that didn't make life easy for them. They called their apartment the Dollhouse Mansion. The name was playful, but it also spoke to their spirit. The walls were painted bright pink, and the rooms were filled with energy, music, and laughter. It was not a large space, but it felt alive. To outsiders, it might have looked chaotic. To them, it was home. Life inside the Dollhouse Mansion was both joy and hardship. Some nights, the friends threw parties, filling the apartment with music and people. Other nights, they stayed up late talking about their fears, their hopes, and the lives they dreamed of building. Together, they faced the reality of the world outside. Finding steady work was hard. Many employers looked at them with suspicion or refused to hire them altogether. When they did get jobs, harassment was common, and on the streets they often faced open hostility. There were nights when Sage and Aubrey were harassed while walking home, chased by a group of men yelling slurs. There were days when strangers made it clear they didn't think they belonged, and there were times when the weight of being so visible and so vulnerable became almost too heavy. But in the safety of their apartment, they had each other. They encouraged one another. They laughed, they danced, and they celebrated small victories. They also looked out for each other in more serious ways. The friends often met men, sometimes through social gatherings, sometimes through more discreet channels. In a world where many men lived double lives, Sage and her friends were pulled into situations that could be risky. Some of these men were married, some were dating women, some were publicly straight, but secretly attracted to transgender women. The danger was always there, and the friends knew it. So they made a rule. They always told one another when they were meeting someone. It was their way of staying safe, of making sure no one disappeared without someone knowing where they had gone. The dollhouse mansion wasn't perfect. Money was always short. There were arguments, especially when stress piled up. But what made it special was the bond the three young women shared. They were not just roommates, they were sisters. And in those moments when the world outside seemed too harsh, it was this chosen family that reminded Sage she wasn't alone. But soon, the safety of that little pink apartment would be tested, because the nights of laughter and music would be interrupted by a series of events that would change everything. To understand Sage's story, you must also understand the city where she lived, Charlottesville, Virginia. On the surface, Charlottesville seemed like an ordinary college town. It had history, charm, and the University of Virginia at its heart. Tourists came to see the old homes of Presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe. To outsiders, it looked like a picture of American pride. But underneath that polished image was a complicated and painful history, one that shaped the lives of people like Sage. Charlottesville was spared destruction during the Civil War. The city's mayor surrendered early to Union troops, which meant little rebuilding was needed after the war. Economically, Charlottesville moved forward faster than many southern towns, but that did not mean progress for everyone. When slavery ended, freed black families stayed in Charlottesville and built communities within the city. The most well-known was Vinegar Hill, a thriving African-American neighborhood. But freedom did not mean equality. During the Jim Crow era, Charlottesville, like much of the South, was divided by segregation. Restaurants, schools, churches, and even stores were separated by race. Laws and voting restrictions were designed to silence black citizens. Though black families made up a large part of the city, they were denied real power. Interracial marriage was banned. The Ku Klux Klan was active in Virginia, and in Charlottesville their presence was felt. Lynchings, threats, and cross burnings haunted black communities. Families like those in Vinegar Hill had to live with constant fear. When the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that schools must integrate, Charlottesville resisted. Instead of bringing children together, the city closed its schools rather than allow black and white students to sit side by side. And then came another blow. In 1965, city leaders passed a law that allowed unsafe or unsanitary homes to be taken over for redevelopment. Most of those homes were in Vinegar Hill. 130 houses, 5 black-owned businesses, and a church were demolished in the name of urban renewal. Families were forced out. For 10 years, nothing replaced it. Eventually, a shopping mall was built where the community once stood. To many, it looked deliberate. It looked like Charlottesville wanted to erase its black neighborhoods. But the people did not vanish. Families who had lived in Vinegar Hill moved into places like Fifield, another historically black neighborhood downtown. And it was in Fifield where Sage and her grandmother lived, and where she built much of her young life. Charlottesville, though, continued to carry its struggles. Even in recent years, conflict over history and race ran deep. The most infamous moment came in 2017, long after Sage's disappearance, when the city became a national focus. For decades, a downtown park had held a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. To many black residents, the statue was not a piece of harmless history. It was a symbol of slavery, oppression, and violence. In 2017, the city voted to remove the statue and rename the park Emancipation Park. White supremacists responded with a rally they called Unite the Right. Protesters and counter-protesters clashed in Charlottesville's streets. One white nationalist drove his car into a crowd, killing a young woman named Heather Heyer and injuring 19 others. The event shocked the nation and reminded the world of the racial divide that still lived in the city. For families like Sage's, none of this was surprising. They had lived through generations of Charlottesville's contradictions, a city that called itself a great place to live for all its citizens, while often failing its black residents. And for Sage, being both black and transgender meant she was among the most marginalized of all. In 2012, when she disappeared, that reality would play a devastating role in how her case was handled. November 19th, 2012. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a small birthday gathering in Charlottesville. Nothing unusual, nothing that seemed dangerous at first. Sage was invited. She arrived dressed with her usual spark, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who wanted to be noticed. She was only 19, yet she had already built a reputation in the local LGBTQ community. She could be bold, outspoken, sometimes fiery, but she was also young, vulnerable, and still figuring out who she was becoming. The party, though small, was filled with energy. Music played, people laughed, and the scent of food and drinks filled the space. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Friends talked in little groups, shifting between serious conversations and bursts of laughter. But as the night went on, tension began to creep in. Something, perhaps old arguments, hidden jealousy, or simple misunderstandings, sparked a disagreement. Words grew sharper, voices rose. For Sage, being outspoken sometimes meant she clashed with others. That night was no different. The arguments got heated, people chose sides, and the mood shifted from celebration to conflict. What had started as a birthday party slowly began to break apart. By the time the fight ended, the gathering was no longer joyful. Some people left angry, others frustrated, and the rest simply confused about what had just happened. But for Sage, that night carried more weight than just a ruined party. It would become one of the final nights she was seen alive. No one in that room could have known it then. But the last party would soon turn into the opening chapter of a mystery that still haunts Charlottesville to this day. The day after the party, the air in Charlottesville felt calmer than the night before. But for Sage, the tension from that birthday gathering had not completely faded. She had argued with people she knew, and though disagreements were not new to her, this one seemed to stay in the back of her mind. That morning, she woke up and moved about as usual, but she was not the type to keep quiet about what was bothering her. She talked about the conflict from the night before, letting others know she was still unsettled. To those closest to her, it was clear she had more to say, more to resolve. Still, life had to move forward. Sage had plans. She wasn't someone who disappeared into silence. She was active, present, and always connected to the people around her. That morning, she kept in touch, speaking with friends, showing up where she needed to be, moving through her day as if nothing serious had changed. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of her morning, something was shifting. Conversations hinted at new connections, private plans, and people who were coming into her life at that exact moment. By the afternoon, Sage had her mind set on meeting someone. It wasn't random. It was arranged, planned ahead, and confirmed through messages. Whoever she was supposed to meet that night, it was important enough that she spoke about it openly. She didn't hide it. To her family and friends, this seemed like just another day. Sage had done this before, making plans, meeting people, living freely. No one thought that this particular day would mark the beginning of her disappearance. As the sun went down, Sage prepared herself. She would step out into the night with confidence, expecting to return as she always did. But this time, she would never make it back. As evening settled over Charlottesville, Sage's day began to take a decisive turn. The casual hours of the morning and afternoon were gone. Now, her attention was fixed on one thing: the meeting she had planned. She had been in contact with someone. The details of this connection were not a mystery to her friends. She had spoken about it. But while they knew she was planning to meet someone, they didn't know just how important that meeting would turn out to be. Her phone was active that night. Calls were made. Messages were exchanged. Sage was in motion, communicating, arranging, and confirming. Among those calls was one that stood out: the last phone call before she vanished. The person on the other end mattered. It wasn't a stranger, it was someone she knew. The conversation itself was ordinary on the surface, but in hindsight, it became a key piece of the puzzle. That call would be the last time anyone heard her voice directly. When she ended the call, Sage was moving with purpose. She left behind the safety of familiar places and stepped into the night. She believed she was heading toward a meeting, perhaps to talk, perhaps to resolve something, perhaps for reasons only she fully understood. But whatever the expectation was, she never made it back. Her phone, once active and buzzing with life, would soon go silent. That silence marked the point where her ordinary world stopped, and the mystery began. After that final phone call, Sage's movements were no longer routine. She wasn't heading to meet a group of friends, nor was she heading home. Instead, she was going somewhere specific, somewhere important to her. The night air in Charlottesville was cool. People were moving in and out of late night spots, cars passed by, and the ordinary rhythm of the town carried on. Yet Sage was stepping out of that ordinary rhythm. She was moving toward a private meeting, one arranged between her and another person. Her friends later explained that Sage had mentioned the meeting. She had spoken about it in a way that seemed casual, as though she had it all under control. There was no fear in her voice, no hesitation in her words. She believed she could handle it. That was who she was: independent, determined, unwilling to let anyone else dictate her choices. But as the minutes ticked on, something shifted. The call that had just ended was her last known contact. From that point forward, Sage was not seen by anyone who could confirm her safety. There were no more updates, no more conversations, no more signs of her returning to her normal life. By the time the clock moved deeper into the night, her phone, once a steady link to her, fell silent. No calls, no texts, no pings on social media. For someone as connected as Sage, that silence was unusual. It wasn't like her to disappear without a word. And yet, that's exactly what happened. The world around her kept moving, unaware that a disappearance had just taken place. Friends went about their night, people laughed in nearby streets, and life carried on. But Sage was gone. That moment, when her phone went dark, when her presence vanished, became the sharp edge between what was known and what would forever remain uncertain. Her story, up until that point, had been one of a young woman balancing school, friendships, and choices. But from this moment on, her story turned into a mystery. The next day, people would begin to notice her absence. Calls would go unanswered. Messages would remain unseen. Concern would grow. But on that night, at that precise point in time, no one yet realized that Sage Smith had vanished into silence. The next morning came, and with it, the ordinary movements of life in Charlottesville. Students were waking, heading to classes, checking their phones. But Sage's phone remained silent. Her closest friends were the first to notice. At first, they didn't panic. Maybe she had stayed the night with someone she trusted. Maybe she was simply tired and had slept in. That wasn't unusual for a college student, but as the hours went by, something about the silence grew heavier. By late morning, messages started to pile up on her phone. Messages she never opened. Her friends sent texts, short and simple. "Where are you? You good? Call me." None of them received a reply. When the afternoon stretched on without a word from her, the worry became sharper. Sage was not the kind of person to disappear from her circle without explanation. She was social, always checking in, always keeping contact alive. Her silence was out of character. By evening, her absence was impossible to ignore. One friend remembered how she had mentioned meeting someone that night, a man she had been speaking with. That detail suddenly stood out, like a shadow that had been there all along but only now seemed darker. Her friends tried calling again. The phone rang, but Sage didn't pick up. Every unanswered ring was another knot tightening in their stomachs. It was then they began asking themselves harder questions. Who had she gone to meet? Why hadn't she come back? And most importantly, where was she now? That night, as the group of friends quietly traded their worries, they came to a shared conclusion. Something was not right. Sage wasn't just running late. She wasn't just distracted. She was missing. This was the moment the line between concern and alarm was crossed. And from that point forward, the search for Sage Smith truly began. When night fell and Sage still hadn't returned, her friends could no longer carry the weight of worry alone. They knew this was different. This wasn't a case of her simply staying out late. It wasn't like her to ignore everyone for an entire day. Finally, one of her friends decided it was time to call her family. The phone call was hesitant at first, almost cautious, as if speaking the fear aloud would make it real. But the moment Sage's family picked up, the unease spilled out in rushed words. "We haven't seen Sage. She didn't come back last night. She's not answering her phone." On the other end of the line, Sage's relatives felt an immediate jolt of panic. They knew her patterns. Sage was independent, yes, but she was also deeply connected to those around her. She wasn't someone who disappeared without letting her family know where she was. Her grandmother, who loved her fiercely, was among the first to sense the gravity. She asked the same questions the friends had already asked themselves. Who was she with? When did you last hear from her? Has anyone checked her apartment? The answers brought no comfort. Nobody had seen her since the night before. Nobody knew where she had gone. Nobody could explain the silence. That night, the family began making their own calls. They reached out to other friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen her. Each conversation ended the same way. No one knew. As the hours passed, worry hardened into fear. It was not just unusual that Sage had vanished. It was impossible to ignore. The silence around her had become a presence of its own, like a shadow in every room. By the end of the night, the truth was undeniable. Sage Smith was missing, and from that moment, her family and friends moved together with one shared purpose: to find her. The next morning, Sage's grandmother could no longer sit in silence. The fear that had built up through the night weighed on her chest, and she knew what needed to be done. She picked up the phone and made the call no family ever wants to make. She reported Sage missing to the police. At first, the response from the authorities carried a tone that was almost dismissive. They asked routine questions, checking boxes one by one. When did you last see her? Has she ever stayed away overnight before? Could she be with friends? Her grandmother's voice grew firm. This wasn't a misunderstanding, and it wasn't a matter of Sage choosing to be away. She wouldn't just disappear, she insisted. This isn't like her. Something is wrong. For Sage's family, the hours crawled. They expected swift action, but what came instead felt painfully slow. Officers noted her name, her description, and the circumstances. But in those first hours, there was no urgent search, no immediate sense of alarm from the system that was supposed to protect her. Meanwhile, her friends tried to do what the police hadn't yet begun. They retraced steps. They called numbers in her phone. They asked around the neighborhood. Still, no one had seen her. No one had answers. The apartment, when checked again, offered no sign of where she had gone. Her belongings were left behind in ways that made no sense. It looked as if she had stepped out for a moment and never come back. For her family, this was confirmation of their worst fear. Sage had not chosen to vanish. Something had happened. As the day passed into evening, word spread further. People in the community began to hear that Sage was missing. Some reacted with disbelief, others with quiet dread. Everyone knew her energy, her presence, and the idea that she was simply gone was too heavy to accept. By the end of that day, one truth was unavoidable. This was no ordinary disappearance. This was the beginning of a fight to find Sage, a fight that would soon expose just how flawed the system could be when it came to protecting someone like her. In the days following Sage's disappearance, her family and friends carried a weight that only grew heavier with each hour. At first, they clung to hope. Maybe she would walk through the door. Maybe she would call. But every ring of the phone that wasn't her, every knock at the door that brought no answers, deepened their fear. Her grandmother, though strong, looked more fragile with each passing day. She kept the phone close, as if holding it tighter would somehow make it ring. Her voice, once firm when she reported Sage missing, now carried cracks whenever she spoke about her. Where could she be? Who has her? These were questions she asked out loud, but no one had answers. Sage's friends refused to stand still. They organized themselves, determined to find her. They walked the same streets she had walked, checked the places she liked to go, and asked anyone who might have seen something. Flyers with her photo began to appear, taped to lampposts, shop windows, and notice boards. Each flyer carried her smile, now frozen in time, asking for help from strangers. But while her loved ones poured their energy into searching, the authorities moved at a slower pace. To them, Sage was just another name on a list of missing people. They asked routine follow-up questions, but no active search parties were sent. No urgent door-to-door checks were made. It was as if the system had already decided that Sage's case didn't demand immediate attention. This difference between the community's desperation and the police's caution was stark. It left her family angry, but also powerless. They could only push, hoping someone in authority would finally listen and act. Meanwhile, whispers began to travel in the community. People spoke in hushed voices, wondering if Sage had run into trouble with someone she knew, or if a stranger had crossed her path. Some speculated, some judged. But her family knew the truth. Sage wouldn't simply vanish. The nights were the hardest. Every sunset reminded them that another day had ended without her return. Her grandmother often sat by the window, staring into the darkness, unwilling to go to bed in case Sage came back and needed her. Sleep became rare. Hope and fear became constant companions. It was in these early days that the fight for Sage's story truly began. Her family and friends were determined not to let her become just another missing person file left to gather dust. They didn't know it yet, but their persistence would soon uncover painful truths. Truths that would expose both what happened to Sage and the failures that allowed her case to be ignored for far too long. As the days stretched on, the community around Sage began to feel the weight of her absence. At first, people were supportive, joining her family in putting up flyers and sharing her picture on social media. But soon, tension began to creep in. Some neighbors whispered among themselves, asking hard questions. Had Sage gotten into trouble? Was she hiding? Or had something far darker happened? The rumors hurt her family deeply. They knew Sage. She was responsible, kind and close to those she loved. Running away didn't make sense, and neither did the idea that she'd disappear without leaving a trace. Yet gossip is powerful, and in small communities it spreads quickly. While the family battled whispers, her friends refused to let doubt win. They started retracing Sage's last known movements. Someone remembered seeing her the day she vanished, heading toward town. Others thought they'd spotted her talking to someone near a store. But every lead was fragile, like smoke that vanished when you tried to hold on to it. Despite the family's efforts, the authorities remained slow. Officers noted down the supposed sightings, but little action followed. There were no wide searches in wooded areas, no press conferences calling for tips. It was as though her case had been placed on a shelf waiting for time to pass. The silence frustrated the community. It created a quiet anger, especially among those who believed Sage's disappearance wasn't being taken seriously because of who she was. Her family began to feel the sting of indifference. Each unanswered call to the police station made the truth harder to ignore. If they wanted answers, they would have to push for them themselves. In the meantime, her grandmother and close friends organized their own search. They walked through fields, checked abandoned lots, and asked anyone who might have seen something unusual. At night, exhausted, they gathered and talked through every clue. But the more they searched, the more impossible the puzzle seemed. Still, there was one thing they all agreed on. Sage hadn't simply disappeared by choice. Something had happened, something deliberate, and though they didn't yet know what, they were determined to keep looking until the truth surfaced. This determination, however, would soon clash with the reality of how missing person cases are often handled, a painful discovery that would only deepen the family's fight for justice. Frustration grew heavier with each passing day. Sage's family had been patient at first, believing the authorities would step in with urgency. But as the hours turned to days and days stretched into weeks, it became painfully clear that the system was moving far too slowly. Her grandmother, the one who had always been Sage's anchor, couldn't stay silent anymore. She began making phone calls to local reporters, pleading with them to cover Sage's case. "She is not just a name on paper," she would tell them. "She is my granddaughter, she is loved, and she deserves to be found." Friends echoed her cry. They stood outside small community centers, handing out flyers with Sage's photo printed on them, her wide eyes staring back at every passerby. Some people took them politely, others glanced away uncomfortably, but the family kept going, determined not to let her story fade. When they approached the police again, they asked for updates, for search teams, for more effort. The answers were vague. Officers repeated phrases like, "We're looking into it," and "We'll let you know if anything comes up." Those words felt hollow. Nothing in their tone carried urgency, and the family could sense it. It was then that her brother stepped forward in a more public way. He began to speak openly about what he saw as a failure, the lack of seriousness in how the disappearance of a transgender woman was being handled. He reminded people that Sage was not a statistic or a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was human, and she deserved equal attention. His words struck a chord. Local activists began to take notice, offering their voices to the family's cause. They spoke about how cases like Sage's often went ignored and how communities needed to demand accountability. The family, once quiet and grieving, now found themselves stepping into a role they never asked for, becoming fighters not only for Sage, but also for others who had disappeared under similar shadows. But as they pressed louder, they faced resistance too. Some in authority seemed irritated by their persistence, as if their pleas were inconvenient rather than urgent. It was another wound to the family's already raw grief. Still, they would not stop. They could not stop. Behind closed doors, her grandmother prayed, asking for strength. Her brother stayed up late at night, scrolling through messages, looking for any clue, any sign that might bring them closer to Sage. Each of them carried the same silent thought: we have to keep pushing, because if we stop, the world will forget her. And that was something they simply could not allow. The pressure the family applied began to ripple outward. What had once felt like a private tragedy was now slowly becoming a matter of public concern. Flyers with Sage's face started appearing on shop windows, pinned to bulletin boards in laundromats, and taped on light poles across town. Her name was no longer confined to whispers among relatives. It was being spoken out loud by strangers. Community activists, already aware of how vulnerable transgender women were to violence and neglect, quickly joined in. They understood too well that Sage's case was not isolated. To them, her disappearance reflected a much larger problem, one that demanded attention. They began organizing small gatherings, vigils, and press conferences. Holding candles, they spoke Sage's name into microphones so her story could not be ignored. Local news outlets, pushed by the family's persistence, finally started running small stories. At first, they were brief, only a few lines tucked into late-night broadcasts. But as the voices grew louder, the coverage began to expand. Reporters came to the family's home, cameras catching the pain etched into their faces, microphones recording the urgency in their voices. Sage's grandmother became a central figure during this time. Standing firm despite her grief, she spoke with calm but unshakable determination. "My granddaughter matters," she told the press. "Her life matters, and I will not stop until she is found." Her words carried the kind of weight that pierced through the indifference of those who had once looked away. Search efforts spread to nearby counties. Volunteers scoured wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and stretches of lonely back roads. Some brought dogs, others simply relied on their own determination. Every rustle in the leaves, every empty field, carried with it a flicker of hope, followed quickly by heartbreak when nothing appeared. But while the community pressed on, the family could not shake the feeling that official efforts were still lacking. The police presence was minimal, the updates rare. It was as though the case had been placed at the bottom of a long list, and Sage's life was being measured against priorities that seemed to matter more to the system than to her loved ones. For her family, this widening search brought mixed emotions. On one hand, they were no longer alone. The world was finally beginning to notice, but on the other, every day without answers felt like a clock ticking louder and louder. They clung to the hope that somewhere, somehow Sage was still out there. But hope alone was not enough, and so the search widened, not only in geography, but in voices, in determination, and in the growing realization that this was no longer just about Sage. It was about justice, equality, and the demand for every missing life to be valued the same. Weeks of searching had gone by, and the family was living in a constant cycle of phone calls, dead ends, and sleepless nights. Then, finally, something shifted. Investigators began sharing that they had found possible leads connected to Sage's disappearance. It wasn't much, but for a family that had been starved of information, even the smallest detail felt like oxygen. Police revealed that they had tracked Sage's last known movements. She had been seen on surveillance footage, moving through the downtown area not long before she vanished. The footage wasn't clear, but it confirmed something very important. Sage hadn't simply chosen to disappear, as some had cruelly suggested. She was out in public, living her life, right up until the moment everything changed. Detectives also identified individuals who had been in contact with her around that time. They began interviewing these people, trying to piece together a timeline. For the family, this was both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because answers finally seemed possible. Terrifying because those answers might confirm their deepest fears. Sage's grandmother remembered sitting across from the investigators during one of these updates. She held her hands folded tightly, her voice steady as she asked the question that haunted her most. "Did someone hurt my grandchild?" The officer paused before responding, his silence speaking louder than words. They couldn't say yes, but they couldn't say no either. News of the investigation's progress spread quickly. Local reporters framed it as a turning point. Community activists doubled their efforts, demanding justice not only for Sage, but for every case like hers that had gone overlooked. Meanwhile, the family was caught in the unbearable space between knowing too little and imagining too much. Every ring of the phone could bring relief or devastation. Every update from detectives was like a single puzzle piece handed to them without the picture on the box. And yet, even in this painful uncertainty, the family held on to something powerful. The knowledge that Sage's case was no longer silent. Her name was being spoken, her face recognized, and her life treated with the value it deserved. This was the first sign of answers. Not the full truth, not yet, but enough to remind them that the fight for Sage's justice was far from over. The silence that had weighed on Sage's family for weeks was finally broken. Investigators came forward with something more solid than rumors or blurry camera images. They revealed that they had spoken to a man who had been in contact with Sage on the very night she disappeared. This man admitted that he had arranged to meet her. He said they had plans, but according to him, something changed. His story was simple. He claimed that after meeting briefly, Sage left in another direction, walking off alone into the night. At first, detectives listened carefully, writing down every word. But when they looked closer, his version of events did not fit with the timeline they were building. Phone records painted a different picture. Sage's last calls and text messages did not match his story. Investigators noticed gaps, times he couldn't account for. And then there was something else. People who knew Sage well said she would never just walk off like that. Not in that area, not at that hour. She was careful, always aware of her surroundings. The man's story grew weaker the more it was examined. Detectives pressed harder, asking him to explain the inconsistencies. His answers shifted, small details changing with each retelling. What he first described as a short meeting became a longer one. What he first claimed was a casual conversation became something more complicated. For Sage's family, this news was crushing and relieving at the same time. Crushing because it hinted that someone she trusted, or at least agreed to meet, might have played a role in her disappearance. Relieving because the vague uncertainty was finally giving way to real suspects, real leads. The community's response was swift. People gathered outside, holding signs that demanded action. Justice for Sage was now more than a slogan. It was a movement. Reporters followed every update, and strangers offered tips, hoping to help. Inside the police department, detectives began treating this man not just as someone connected, but as someone central to the case. They retraced his movements, looked into his past, and checked his alibis. Slowly, a darker picture started to form. For the family, every update felt like being dragged deeper into a nightmare. Yet, at the same time, they could not look away. If this was the path to the truth, they were willing to walk it, no matter how painful each step became. Sage's grandmother later said those days were some of the hardest. We were finally close to answers, she recalled. But close to answers means close to pain. The break in the case had come, and with it, the road ahead was about to get even more difficult. Detectives sat across from the man who had quickly become the focus of their investigation. At first, he carried himself with confidence, as if he believed he could explain everything away. His arms were folded, his eyes steady, and his words came sharp and quick. He told the officers he had no involvement, no reason to hurt Sage, and that the police were wasting their time. But as the hours passed, the steady voice began to falter. The questions the detectives asked were no longer simple. They were layered, precise, built on information they had carefully gathered. With every inconsistency in his answers, the cracks in his story grew wider. When asked where he was on the night Sage was last seen, his story shifted. At first he said he was at home. Later he admitted he had gone out for a short drive. Then, when pressed, he claimed he had been near the same area Sage had disappeared. Each change pulled him deeper into suspicion. The detectives noticed how his hands fidgeted, how sweat formed along his hairline. He asked for breaks, he asked for water, and each time he returned, his words became less convincing. His confidence was slipping, and the officers could feel it. Meanwhile, evidence from the search teams began to pile onto the table in front of them. Phone records showed activity near the location where Sage's body had been discovered. Witnesses had described seeing his car in the area late at night, parked longer than seemed normal. Even small details, like the clothes he claimed he wore that evening, didn't line up with what neighbors remembered. The walls were closing in. The detectives didn't raise their voices, and they didn't threaten him. They let silence work its way into the room, long pauses that seemed to stretch forever. And in those moments of quiet, the man looked less like someone in control and more like someone trapped. Finally, when asked once again to explain his movements, he hesitated too long. His answer stumbled, his timeline fell apart, and the detectives, watching closely, knew they were getting closer to the truth. What had begun as a steady denial was now unraveling into confusion. For the first time, the suspect leaned back in his chair, rubbed his face with both hands, and avoided their eyes. He was no longer the confident man who had walked into the room. The investigation had reached a critical turning point. The detectives could feel it. The case was tightening, the evidence was circling him, and the truth was no longer something he could escape. And yet, he still refused to admit the full story. The room fell into silence once more, leaving both the investigators and the suspect in a tense standoff. The truth was close, but not yet spoken aloud. The questioning grew more intense as the investigators returned again to the same point. The times, the places, the movements he had claimed. Every time he tried to answer, his story seemed to shift slightly, and the officers caught it. At first, he gave short, confident replies, but the more they pressed, the more he hesitated. A pause before an answer, a correction to something he had just said, a slip of memory that didn't match what was already recorded. These moments might have seemed small, but to trained detectives, they stood out like flashing lights. When asked again about where he was during a key stretch of time, he tried to adjust his earlier statement. He added in a detail that hadn't been there before. That was a mistake. The officers noted immediately that this wasn't what he had told them in the first round of questions. They didn't react openly, but they wrote it down. One officer leaned forward, lowering his voice, and asked him directly why his answers were changing. He gave a weak laugh, trying to cover the slip, and said he had just been nervous. But the way he said it didn't carry much weight. His tone had lost the firmness it had in the beginning. The detectives kept going, letting the silence after each answer stretch longer. He shifted in his seat, his arms folded across his chest, then unfolded again. His eyes began darting to the table instead of holding steady on the men questioning him. Piece by piece, the calm front he had tried to maintain was breaking down. The investigation was tightening around him, and the officers could sense it. The investigators leaned forward, their patience thinning. They had listened to contradiction after contradiction, and each one chipped away at the story. At first, the accused tried to look calm, even confident, but his eyes kept moving, darting from one corner of the room to the other, as though searching for an escape that wasn't there. He wiped his hands against his knees, a nervous habit he couldn't hide anymore. The lead detective laid out the facts, one after another. Every movement, every timeline, every word he had claimed before was tested against the evidence gathered. Phone records didn't match. Witness statements clashed with his own. The small lies he thought might protect him were now unraveling. The silence between questions grew heavier. It was the kind of silence that demanded the truth. The detective's voice stayed calm but firm, pressing deeper, pointing out every hole. And slowly, the accused began to falter. His tone weakened, his answers shortened. He avoided direct eye contact, and for the first time, his voice carried a tremor that had not been there before. What had started as a bold denial was now shifting into hesitation, and the investigators could sense it. He was close to breaking. The air in the room felt different now. The detectives had pushed him into a corner, and he knew it. Every answer he gave only led to another inconsistency, another trap he couldn't escape. One officer leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching closely. The other leaned forward, voice steady but sharp, laying out the facts in order. There was no shouting, no threats, just the quiet, crushing weight of truth piling higher and higher against him. He tried to hold on to fragments of his story, but each piece slipped away. He stammered when pressed on the exact times. He paused too long when asked about his movements. And when confronted with evidence, undeniable, clear, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, lowering his eyes to the floor. For the first time, his confidence was gone. His words no longer carried the certainty of before. Instead, there was hesitation, a crack in his defense that the detectives quickly noticed. The silence between each question grew longer. He seemed to struggle not only with the investigators, but with himself, caught between the lie he wanted to maintain and the truth that weighed heavily on him. And as the minutes dragged on, it became obvious. The story he had built was collapsing. The detectives leaned in, carefully controlling the pace. They had no need to rush. He was unraveling on his own. One of them slid a piece of paper across the table. On it were times, dates, and movements that had already been verified. They asked him to explain how his version fit with the record. His eyes darted across the page, scanning for a way out, but there was none. He shifted in his seat, running a hand over his face. The words came out slower now, weaker, each one carrying less conviction than the last. He knew the evidence was closing in on him. Every time he hesitated, the silence in the room grew heavier. The officers didn't fill it with more questions right away. They let it hang there, making him feel the weight of it, forcing him to face his own contradictions. Finally, he tried to stick to his old explanation, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying him. The detectives exchanged a glance. They could see the break forming. Then one officer asked a simple question, not complicated, not aggressive, just a straight, direct challenge. If that's the truth, why doesn't anything match? The room went quiet again. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His hands fidgeted on the table, and his breathing grew heavier. In that silence, everything shifted. The strong front he had built from the start of questioning was gone. And for the first time, he looked less like a man with answers and more like a man cornered by the truth. The investigators knew they had reached a breaking point. For days, they had listened to shifting stories, half-truths, and contradictions. But now, the pressure was finally beginning to work. When the suspect was brought back into the interview room, there was a subtle change. He no longer sat upright and defiant. His shoulders sagged. His eyes, which once darted sharply, now seemed heavy and uncertain. It was as if the weight of his own lies was pressing down on him. The officers didn't start with accusations. They began calmly, revisiting the timeline, step by step. Every time he gave an answer, they pointed out a gap, a missing piece. His version of events no longer held together. The more they pressed, the more obvious it became. The story he had built so carefully was now crumbling. At first, he tried to stand his ground, muttering that people were mistaken, that others were trying to pin blame on him. But the detectives didn't argue. Instead, they laid down the facts: phone records, witness statements, and forensic evidence. Each piece was like another nail, sealing the truth in place. Finally, there was his silence in the room. He lowered his head. His fingers tapped against the table, restless and uneasy. The detectives waited. They didn't rush him. They knew this was the moment he was either going to break or lie once more. And then, slowly, his words shifted. What had been denial now became fragments of admission. Not the full truth, not yet, but small cracks of honesty breaking through. He admitted being there. He admitted knowing more than he had first said. The room grew heavier. The detectives exchanged quick glances but stayed composed. They had pulled him to the edge. Now they needed to guide him the rest of the way. The shift in his tone did not go unnoticed. The detectives leaned forward slightly, careful not to interrupt the fragile moment. They had seen this many times before, the exact point where denial starts to collapse under the weight of truth. He rubbed his palms together, avoiding eye contact. His words came slower, almost reluctant, as if each one carried a burden. "I was there," he admitted quietly, but he quickly added excuses, trying to soften the impact. He insisted it wasn't how people thought, that things had been misunderstood. The detectives let him talk. They knew that once the door of admission cracked open, pushing too hard could make him retreat. Instead, they kept him moving forward, guiding him with carefully chosen questions. Each question narrowed his options, removing the space for more lies. Bit by bit, his version of events shifted closer to reality. He described places, moments, and actions that matched the evidence already collected. For the first time, his story began to line up with the facts, though still missing the darkest pieces. One detective asked him why he hadn't said this from the beginning. He sighed, staring down at the table. His answer was almost a whisper, "Because I knew what it would mean." That single sentence carried the weight of guilt. It was not yet a confession, but it was the clearest sign that he understood the truth could no longer be buried. The officers exchanged a brief look. They knew they had crossed the line between denial and reluctant honesty. Now, it was only a matter of how much more he was willing to reveal. The detectives could feel that the balance in the room had shifted. The suspect, who once spoke with sharp defiance, now sounded weighed down. His voice no longer carried the same fight. Instead, it carried hesitation, the kind that comes when someone is running out of lies. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall as if searching for an escape. But the escape was gone. The evidence pinned him too tightly. Every record, every witness, every trace pointed to him. Slowly, he began to talk more openly. He admitted details that he had once denied, where he had been, what he had done, who he had seen. The detectives listened carefully, writing everything down, making sure the timeline was clear. They didn't interrupt much. They let him fill the silence, because silence was now working against him. Still, he tried to control the narrative. He painted himself as someone who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, someone who hadn't meant for things to spiral. But the officers were patient. Each time he tried to soften his role, they gently brought him back with the hard facts. One detective laid down a photograph on the table. It was a piece of evidence he couldn't ignore. His eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, his composure slipped. He swallowed hard and shifted in his seat. That reaction told the detectives more than his words. They knew they had touched the nerve. He was close to saying the words they had been waiting for since the beginning. The room was quiet, except for the sound of his restless breathing. The tension was thick, but it was no longer the tension of resistance. It was the tension of truth, fighting to surface. The photograph on the table stayed between them like a silent witness. He avoided looking at it, but the detectives could see the effect it had on him. His shoulders hunched forward and his hands fidgeted restlessly. One of the detectives leaned in, his tone calm but firm. He reminded the suspect that running from the truth had only made things worse. "You've carried this weight long enough," he said softly. "It's time to put it down." The suspect drew in a long breath. For the first time since the questioning began, his words came out unguarded. He admitted being present at the scene. He admitted knowing more than he had shared before. The story he had built up brick by brick was starting to crumble. Still, he hesitated at the final step. He spoke in circles, describing the events but carefully avoiding the direct admission of responsibility. It was as if part of him wanted to confess, while another part fought to hold back. The detectives didn't push too hard. They let the silence work for them. Minutes stretched, and the sound of the ticking clock filled the room. Finally, he looked up, his face pale, his voice breaking slightly. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said. Those words hit the room like a confession without being one. They revealed more than he realized. The detectives exchanged a quick glance, knowing they were almost there. Every wall he had built around himself was falling. Piece by piece, his role was becoming clear, and soon there would be no turning back. The moment the suspect muttered, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," the detectives knew they had broken through. The carefully built shield of denial and excuses had cracked wide open. One of the detectives leaned forward and spoke gently, but with purpose. He explained that the truth was already laid out in the evidence. The only thing left was for the suspect to admit his part. The suspect lowered his head, his voice softer now. He admitted being there, admitted what he had done, though he still tried to wrap it in explanations, as if that would lessen the weight of his actions. But even those half admissions mattered. They closed the gap between suspicion and certainty. For the investigators, this was the moment they had been working toward from the start. Every detail they had collected, every long hour of piecing together timelines, every contradiction they had chased down, it all came together in that room. By the end of the interview, the truth was no longer hidden. The suspect's own words tied him to the crime. There was no way out. The detectives knew it, and deep down, so did he. When the session ended, the officers stepped out of the room carrying more than just notes. They carried the confession that had eluded them for so long. The case, which once seemed locked in silence and half-truths, now had a clear ending. Justice, though slow and painful, had finally caught up, and with that, the long investigation closed. Not with sudden drama, but with a steady weight of truth that could no longer be denied. And that brings us to the end of this case. A story filled with secrets, choices, and consequences that remind us how fragile trust can be and how quickly lives can change forever. If you've stayed with me until now, you've walked through every moment, every twist, every revelation. And I want to ask you something. If you spent hours listening to this story tonight, don't let it end here. So many of you use these stories to fall asleep. But before you close your eyes, do one small thing for me. Click subscribe, tap like, leave a simple comment, even just a 1, to let me know you are here. Because it takes a lot of time and effort to bring you these long, complete stories with every detail intact. And the only way this channel continues is if you support it. So don't just move on. Don't just disappear like the names in these cases. Stay connected. Be part of this family where real stories are told night after night in full. Thank you for listening. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next story.